Justice Amara Collins had argued before governors, dismantled corrupt politicians, and authored landmark rulings that changed millions of lives. But on an ordinary Saturday morning, wearing jeans and carrying nothing but a bag of groceries, she became just another black woman in the eyes of one police officer. His insults grew louder. His hand drifted toward his weapon. A crowd gathered, and phones rose to record every second. Then, 3 black sport utility vehicles screeched to a halt at the curb. Armed executive protection agents rushed forward, surrounding the woman the officer had just mocked. Seconds later, the police chief arrived, looking terrified, and whispered words that would haunt the officer for the rest of his career. "Do you have any idea who you just stopped?" Justice Amara Collins was 48 years old, a woman whose calm authority had been forged across 2 decades of courtrooms, hearings, and quiet battles most people never saw. She sat on the highest court in the state, a position she had earned not through connections or privilege but through relentless discipline, sharp intellect, and an unshakable belief that the law existed to protect the powerless as much as the powerful. Those who knew her described her the same way every time: composed, brilliant, humble, and entirely uninterested in flaunting her title. She never wore her position like armor. She wore it like a responsibility, something heavy that she carried without complaint, something she refused to let define how she treated ordinary people on ordinary days. That particular Saturday was meant to be exactly that, ordinary. There was no court session, no hearing, no ceremonial dinner waiting for her in the evening. There was only a quiet itch to get out of the house, to breathe fresh air, to remind herself that beneath the robes she was still simply a woman who needed milk, bread, and a few vegetables for the week ahead. She told her security detail she did not need them. She told her assistant the same. She wanted one morning, just one, where nobody opened doors for her and nobody called her Your Honor. She wanted to walk into a grocery store like anyone else, push a cart down the aisles, and pay at the register without ceremony. She dressed plainly that morning in a simple gray sweater, faded jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers she kept for weekends. There was no makeup beyond the bare minimum, no jewelry beyond a thin silver chain that had belonged to her mother. She parked her car, a dark sedan that had been a gift to herself after her first major ruling years earlier, in the small lot beside a corner grocery store she had visited dozens of times before. Nothing about the morning suggested anything unusual was coming. The sky was clear, the air still cool with the last edges of early morning, and the street held the lazy rhythm of a neighborhood waking up slowly. She gathered 2 paper bags of groceries, balanced them against her hip, and walked toward her car with the unhurried calm of someone whose only plan for the day was breakfast and a good book. Few people in that quiet neighborhood understood how far Amara had traveled to reach the position she now held, and fewer still would have guessed it from the modest way she carried herself. She had grown up in a working-class household, where her mother cleaned offices late into the night, and her father drove a delivery truck across 3 counties just to keep the lights on, and she had spent her childhood watching both of them, treated with a casual disrespect by people who assumed exhaustion and humility meant something lesser. She carried that memory with her into every courtroom she ever entered, not as bitterness but as fuel, a quiet promise that she would build a life where dignity was not something anyone could strip away based on appearance alone. She had worked her way through law school on scholarships and long nights, clerked for judges who doubted she would last, and eventually earned a reputation as someone whose rulings were so carefully reasoned that even her fiercest critics struggled to dismantle them. By the time she ascended to the state's highest court, she had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. Yet she never let that hard-won confidence curdle into arrogance. She simply did her work, kept her circle small, and reserved her energy for the cases that mattered, rather than the attention that so often followed people in positions like hers. Officer Derek Mills had been patrolling that same stretch of road for nearly 6 years, and in those 6 years he had built a reputation that followed him from precinct gossip into formal complaints that rarely seemed to stick. Colleagues described him as quick-tempered, eager to escalate, and convinced that his instincts about people, especially black men and women, were always correct. He had joined the force believing, in some abstract way, that he wanted to protect his community. But somewhere along the years, That ambition had curdled into something closer to suspicion of the very people he was sworn to serve. Younger officers who rode with him during training shifts sometimes mentioned, quietly and only among themselves, that he seemed to approach every call already certain of guilt, treating procedure as a formality to be endured rather than a safeguard to be respected. Supervisors occasionally noted his aggressive tendencies in passing evaluations, yet those notes rarely translated into meaningful consequences, buried instead beneath commendations for arrest numbers that looked impressive on paper without anyone questioning how those numbers had been achieved. He had grown comfortable in that gap between scrutiny and accountability, confident that his badge offered him a kind of immunity that ordinary citizens could never access, regardless of how many times his judgment had already proven flawed. He believed he could read guilt in a glance, suspicion in a posture, criminal intent in the simple act of standing near an expensive car. That morning, driving slowly past the grocery store lot, his eyes landed on Amara as she loaded bags into the trunk of her sedan. He did not see a judge. He did not see a woman returning from a quiet errand. He saw, in his own mind, someone who did not belong beside that car, someone whose presence near it struck him as wrong, in a way he could not have explained with evidence, only with the same biased instinct that had shaped his entire career. He pulled his cruiser into the lot, stepped out, and approached her without a greeting, without identifying the nature of his concern, without any of the basic courtesy that should have opened the conversation. His first words were not a question. They were a command, sharp and immediate, hands where I can see them. Amara turned slowly, set the grocery bag down with deliberate care, and raised her hands exactly as instructed, her expression calm, in a way that suggested she had spent years learning how to stay still in the presence of unpredictable power. She had seen this script before, not personally in many years, but through hundreds of cases that had crossed her bench, cases where the smallest gesture from a black citizen had been misread as threat, where compliance had not been enough to prevent escalation. She understood, instinctively, that the safest path forward was patience, stillness, and clarity. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited, hands lifted, eyes steady, while Officer Mills circled her with growing suspicion that had nothing to do with anything she had actually done. Then came the order that signaled just how far this was going to go. Officer Mills told her to turn around and place her hands on the vehicle, to assume the position of someone being searched for a crime that had never been named, never been explained, never been justified by any visible evidence. The grocery bags sat abandoned on the pavement beside her, a carton of eggs tilted dangerously near the edge, a loaf of bread spilling halfway out of its paper sleeve. Amara complied without resistance, turning to face her own car, palms pressed flat against the cool metal, while the officer behind her radiated a kind of righteous certainty that had no foundation beyond his own prejudice. It was, in that quiet parking lot, the beginning of something far larger than either of them could have predicted. What followed was not a brief misunderstanding resolved with an apology. It was an escalation built entirely on assumption, fed by a refusal to ask simple questions before issuing accusations. Officer Mills began interrogating her with a tone meant to intimidate rather than investigate, his questions less about gathering facts and more about asserting dominance over a woman he had already decided was guilty of something. "Where did you get this car?" he demanded, his voice rising loud enough that a man walking his dog across the street slowed his pace to look. "Is this car stolen? Did you forge the registration?" Each question landed without waiting for an answer, as though the act of asking was itself a performance for an audience that was slowly beginning to gather along the sidewalk. A few pedestrians paused near the edge of the lot, drawn by the rising volume of his voice and the unmistakable body language of a confrontation. Phones came out almost instinctively, the modern reflex of a generation that had learned, painfully, that documentation could mean the difference between justice and silence. Amara did not flinch under the growing attention. She kept her hands steady, her voice even, and offered only the kind of measured response that came naturally to someone who had spent a career demanding the same composure from others. "Officer," she said quietly, Please remain professional. It was not a challenge. It was not defiance. It was simply a request rooted in basic decency, the kind of statement she might have made to a junior attorney stumbling through an emotional outburst in her courtroom. But to Derek Mills, those 4 words felt like an insult, a challenge to his authority from someone he believed had no right to correct him. His mind, already clouded by bias, twisted her calm into arrogance, her composure into condescension. He thought, with a flash of resentment he did not bother to hide, "Who does she think she is, lecturing me?" The thought hardened into action. He demanded her license and registration, with a tone sharp enough to draw more attention from the gathering onlookers, and when she reached carefully into her bag to retrieve the documents, he snatched them from her hand without acknowledgement. He glanced at them for only a moment before letting them fall, almost deliberately, onto the asphalt at her feet. A small act of disrespect meant to remind her, and everyone watching, exactly who held power in that moment. The crowd along the sidewalk had grown thicker now, drawn by something instinctive in human nature, the recognition that an injustice might be unfolding in real time. A delivery truck slowed as it passed, the driver leaning out his window briefly before continuing on. A mother pushing a stroller paused at a safe distance, watching with visible unease. Still, Officer Mills pressed forward, undeterred by the audience, perhaps even emboldened by it, the way some people grow louder and more aggressive, precisely because they sense eyes upon them. He straightened his shoulders, rested one hand near his belt, and announced, loud enough for the entire lot to hear, that he was placing her under arrest, that he intended to handcuff her right there on the pavement in front of the grocery store she had visited 100 times before, without incident. Within that gathering crowd, a quiet tension had begun to form between those who wanted to intervene and those who feared the cost of doing so. An older man leaning against a parked truck muttered to his companion that he had seen this exact pattern play out before, in other neighborhoods, with other officers, and that it rarely ended well for the person on the receiving end. A young mother shifted her stroller slightly closer, less out of curiosity and more out of an instinct to bear witness, believing that her presence alone might offer some small measure of protection, simply by existing as another set of eyes. None of them yet understood who Amara was, only that something about the scene felt deeply wrong, the kind of wrongness that did not require a law degree to recognize, only a basic and shared sense of fairness that the officer in front of them seemed determined to ignore. An older woman near the front of the gathering crowd finally spoke up, her voice trembling but firm, insisting that the situation did not warrant such treatment. "Officer, she's cooperating," the woman said, gesturing toward Amara's raised hands and calm posture. Mills barely turned his head before snapping back at her, telling her sharply to mind her own business, his tone leaving no room for further objection. The woman fell silent, though her expression remained one of quiet outrage, the kind that lingers long after a confrontation ends. Nearby, a teenager with a phone held steady continued recording, his thumb occasionally tapping the screen as the video, without his knowledge yet, began circulating through private message threads and small online communities, the digital ripple effect already beginning long before anyone involved understood its scale. Mills, oblivious to the growing reach of the footage being captured, only grew more hostile in response to the woman's intervention. He turned back to Amara and delivered a line that revealed the depth of his prejudice far more clearly than anything he had said before. "People like you always play the victim." The words landed heavily across the small crowd, a few onlookers exchanging glances of disbelief, others simply lowering their phones in stunned silence, as though even recording the moment had become too uncomfortable. Amara, still facing her car with her hands resting against the metal, did not turn around immediately. When she finally did, her expression remained unreadable, neither angry nor afraid, simply present, absorbing the moment with the same discipline she brought to every difficult hearing she had ever presided over. She asked him a single question, delivered without heat, without sarcasm, simply as a matter of procedure. "May I know the legal basis for my detention?" It was the kind of question she had heard attorneys pose 1,000 times in her courtroom, a basic and reasonable demand for justification before any further action was taken. Officer Mills had no real answer. He stammered something about suspicious behavior, about her not fitting the profile of someone who would own a car like that, about instinct and experience, phrases that crumbled under even the lightest scrutiny. He knew, somewhere beneath his anger, that he had nothing solid to stand on, and that realization only made him more desperate to assert control before the situation slipped further from his grasp. In a final act of escalation, he reached down to his belt and unclipped a set of handcuffs, the metallic click audible even over the murmur of the crowd. Gasps rippled through the gathered onlookers, a few people stepping forward instinctively before stopping themselves, uncertain of what intervention might cost them. The teenager with the phone zoomed in, capturing the glint of metal in the morning light, capturing Amara's expression as she watched the cuffs rise toward her wrists with the same steady composure she had maintained from the very beginning. It was, by any measure, the lowest point of the encounter, the moment when an ordinary Saturday morning teetered on the edge of becoming something the entire community would remember for years. It was at that exact moment, with the cuffs only inches from closing around her wrists, that the sound of engines cut sharply through the tension. 3 black sport utility vehicles rounded the corner at a speed that immediately drew every eye in the parking lot, tires screeching as they came to an abrupt stop along the curb. Doors opened in near-perfect unison, and from each vehicle stepped men and women dressed in dark suits, earpieces tucked discreetly into their collars, the unmistakable bulk of body armor visible beneath their jackets. They moved with the precision of people trained for exactly this kind of moment, fanning out into a protective formation before a single word had been exchanged, forming a human wall between Amara and the startled officer holding the handcuffs. These were members of the State Judicial Protection Division, a small and highly trained unit tasked with safeguarding the justices and senior officials whose rulings sometimes drew threats from individuals or groups unhappy with their decisions. Amara had resisted a permanent detail for years, insisting that she did not want to live behind a wall of armed strangers, but the division maintained a quiet protocol of monitoring the movements of protected officials even during personal time, a precaution she had reluctantly agreed to after a credible threat years earlier had forced the issue. That morning, an alert algorithm tracking unusual patterns near her last known location had flagged the encounter within minutes of its escalation, pulling footage from a nearby traffic camera that showed unmistakable signs of distress. The detail had been dispatched not because anyone had called for help, but because the system built to protect her had finally caught up with a danger she had never intended to invite. Officer Mills staggered backward, momentarily disoriented by the sudden intrusion, his hand instinctively dropping toward his own weapon as adrenaline override his judgment. "Back away!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of authority and fear, clearly unprepared for a scenario his training had never quite covered. One of the agents, a tall man with graying temples and the calm bearing of someone who had spent years managing chaos, stepped forward and matched his tone without raising his voice. "You step back," the man said simply, his stance unmoving, his eyes locked on the officer with an intensity that left no room for negotiation. The crowd, already stirred by the earlier confrontation, now buzzed with confusion and disbelief, murmurs rippling outward as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Mills, still gripping his weapon's holster, seemed to genuinely believe, in that fevered moment, that these newcomers were interfering with lawful police business, perhaps even criminals themselves, despite every visual cue suggesting otherwise. His hand tightened, his thumb brushing the strap securing his sidearm, and for a terrifying instant, it seemed as though the situation might spiral into something far more dangerous than a wrongful arrest. The agents did not flinch. They held their formation, calm and immovable, trained for precisely this kind of unpredictable threat. Then, breaking the unbearable tension, the lead agent reached into his jacket and produced a small leather case, flipping it open to reveal a badge unlike anything Officer Mills had seen on the street before. "State Judicial Protection Division," the agent stated clearly, his voice carrying just enough volume for the crowd to hear, but still controlled, still measured. The words landed across the parking lot, like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of understanding, beginning to spread among the onlookers, even as Officer Mills himself remained stubbornly confused about their significance. Mills squinted at the badge, his expression shifting from aggression to something closer to uncertainty, though pride and stubbornness kept him from backing down entirely. "So what?" he muttered, his voice losing some of its earlier conviction. "I'm still placing her under arrest." The agent studying him exchanged a brief glance with his colleagues, an expression that suggested disbelief at the officer's persistence in the face of overwhelming evidence that he had made a catastrophic error. "Think carefully," the agent warned, his tone now edged with something closer to pity than anger, the kind of pity reserved for someone about to learn a very hard lesson in real time. Within the gathered crowd, recognition began to spread in fragments, whispered between strangers who had only moments earlier been silent witnesses. A woman near the front, who had seen news coverage of major court rulings over the years, narrowed her eyes at Amara's face, searching her memory for a connection that suddenly clicked into place. "Wait," she said aloud, almost involuntarily. "Isn't that Justice Collins?" The name rippled outward through the crowd like a current, repeated in hushed disbelief, confirmed and reconfirmed as more people leaned in for a closer look. Comparing the woman standing calmly beside her car to images they vaguely remembered from television screens and newspaper headlines. The teenager who had been recording from the very beginning froze for a moment, staring at his screen in stunned realization before continuing to film with renewed urgency, understanding now that he was capturing something far larger than a routine traffic stop gone wrong. Comments and reactions from those watching the live footage online began pouring in at a pace that quickly overwhelmed casual observation, strangers across the country recognizing the same face, confirming the same identity, expressing the same outrage at what they were witnessing unfold in real time. Word moved fast, faster than anyone standing in that parking lot could have anticipated, racing through phone lines and message threads until it eventually reached someone whose entire career now hung in the balance. That call landed on the desk of Police Chief Robert Hayes, in the middle of an unrelated meeting about budget allocations, his attention pulled sharply away the moment his assistant burst through the door, with visible panic etched across her face. She relayed the situation in fragments, breathless and urgent, but one phrase cut through everything else with absolute clarity. Justice Amara Collins had been detained, possibly handcuffed, by one of his own officers. Hayes felt the blood drain from his face as the implications settled in immediately. Not just the legal consequences, but the sheer magnitude of the mistake unfolding under his command. He did not finish the meeting. He grabbed his jacket, abandoned the papers scattered across the table, and moved toward his vehicle, with a speed his staff had rarely witnessed from him before. During the agonizing minutes it took Hayes to reach the scene, Officer Mills remained entirely unaware of the storm gathering around him, still locked in a standoff with the protective agents who refused to let him near Amara again. He continued arguing, continued insisting he had followed proper procedure, continued refusing even the smallest gesture of apology that might have softened what was coming. He believed, with the stubborn certainty that had defined his entire career, that he had done nothing wrong, that his instincts had been justified, that any consequences awaiting him would be unfair overreactions rather than appropriate accountability. He had no idea that his career, built over 6 years of questionable judgment calls and ignored complaints, was about to collapse in the span of a single morning. When Chief Hayes finally arrived, his car barely came to a complete stop before he was out the door, moving with an urgency that immediately silenced much of the murmuring crowd. He scanned the scene quickly, taking in the protective agents, the abandoned handcuffs dangling from Mills's hand, and finally Amara herself, standing with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Recognition flooded his expression instantly, replaced almost immediately by something closer to dread. "Your Honor," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of immediate respect, his voice carrying an apology before he had even fully formed the words. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened here, but it will not go unanswered." Officer Mills, watching his chief address the woman he had been interrogating only minutes earlier with such deference, felt something cold settle in his stomach as the full weight of his mistake began to register. He opened his mouth to offer some kind of explanation, some justification rooted in the same flawed instincts that had guided him from the very beginning, But the words caught in his throat as Hayes turned toward him with an expression that mixed fury and disbelief in equal measure. "What exactly have you done?" Hayes demanded, his voice low but unmistakably furious, carrying the weight of someone who understood immediately the scale of the disaster unfolding in front of him. The teenager's live stream, still running, had by this point attracted thousands of viewers watching in real time, comments flooding in faster than anyone on scene could have realized. Strangers across the country, bearing witness to a moment that would soon dominate conversations far beyond that single parking lot. Hayes, aware of the cameras even if he could not see every one of them, turned immediately toward damage control, rooted not in performance but in genuine urgency. He ordered the handcuffs removed at once, though they had never actually closed around Amara's wrists, and demanded that any record of the stop be immediately voided, treated as the unjustified action it clearly had been from the very first command Officer Mills had issued. Mills stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, replaced by the stunned silence of a man watching his entire professional identity collapse in real time. He stammered an apology that sounded hollow even to his own ears, words offered too late to undo the damage already captured on dozens of phones and broadcast to a growing audience online. Hayes did not wait for him to finish. He turned back toward Amara, his posture lowered in genuine humility, and asked what she needed, what would help repair even a fraction of the harm that had been done to her that morning. It was only then, for the first time since the confrontation began, that Amara allowed herself to speak with the full weight of her position, rather than simply the patience of a private citizen enduring an injustice. "I am Justice Amara Collins of the State Supreme Court," she said clearly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, carrying easily across the silent crowd that had gathered to witness the entire ordeal. The words landed with the force of confirmation rather than surprise, settling into a crowd that had already begun to suspect as much, yet still felt the full gravity of hearing it spoken aloud. She did not raise her voice to make the statement feel more dramatic. She did not need to. The simple truth of who she was, combined with everything the crowd had just witnessed, carried more weight than any performance could have achieved. Hayes nodded slowly, his expression grim, already understanding that this moment marked only the beginning of consequences that would ripple far beyond that single morning. In the days that followed, the department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal investigation, moving with a speed and seriousness rarely afforded to complaints involving officers like Derek Mills. Investigators pulled body cam footage that confirmed every detail captured by bystanders, the audio painfully clear in its documentation of escalating hostility that had no basis in any actual threat or violation. Surveillance footage from the grocery store's exterior cameras offered another angle, showing Amara calmly loading groceries long before Mills ever approached, undermining any claim that her behavior had appeared suspicious in any reasonable sense. Traffic camera footage from a nearby intersection added still more context, while the original livestream, already viewed by an enormous and growing audience, provided perhaps the most damning record of all, capturing every word and gesture with unforgiving clarity. Investigators found no inconsistency between any of these sources, no detail that offered Mills even a sliver of justification for his actions that morning. Each piece of evidence aligned perfectly with the others, painting a picture of an officer who had escalated a routine encounter into a near catastrophe, based entirely on unfounded suspicion rooted in prejudice rather than fact. As the investigation deepened, officials began revisiting Mills's personnel file, a record that had quietly accumulated complaints over the years without ever triggering serious consequences. Multiple citizens, the vast majority of them, black men and women, had filed reports describing eerily similar patterns: aggressive questioning without cause, escalation in response to calm cooperation, accusations rooted in assumption rather than evidence. Some of these earlier complaints had been dismissed outright, others quietly settled without any formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the kind of bureaucratic erasure that allowed patterns of misconduct to persist unchecked for years. Chief Hayes, reviewing the file personally for the first time with this new context in mind, felt a deepening unease, as he recognized just how long these warning signs had existed without meaningful intervention. He realized, with a discomfort he could not easily dismiss, that the morning's events were not an isolated failure, but rather the predictable outcome of years of institutional negligence, a culture that had allowed one officer's biases to operate without sufficient oversight or accountability. This was not the first time. It was simply the first time the consequences had become impossible to ignore. Among the rediscovered complaints was a report filed nearly 3 years earlier by a young man named Marcus Webb, unrelated to anyone within the protection detail, despite sharing a name, who had described an encounter with Mills almost identical in tone and escalation to what Amara had endured. That complaint had been closed within a matter of weeks, dismissed for what the file vaguely described as insufficient corroborating evidence, despite a bystander video that had been submitted alongside the written statement. Another complaint, filed by a grandmother who had simply been walking home from church, described nearly the same accusatory questioning, the same refusal to explain the legal basis for suspicion, the same hostility when she asked for clarity. Investigators began to understand that Amara's encounter, however shocking to the public, represented not an aberration, but a culmination, the moment when a long pattern of quiet harm finally collided with a level of attention too large for the department to manage away. The pressure building from public attention, fueled by the widespread circulation of the original footage, eventually forced the department into a formal press conference held outside the same precinct where Mills had worked for 6 years. Officials announced his immediate suspension, pending further review, a decision quickly followed by his formal termination, once the internal investigation concluded that his conduct represented a clear and serious violation of departmental policy. Beyond the loss of his position, news outlets reported that a separate civil investigation had been opened, examining whether his actions that morning, and potentially in earlier incidents revealed during the broader review, constituted violations of constitutional rights, warranting further legal consequences. His badge was formally surrendered during a brief and quiet ceremony, witnessed by only a handful of department officials, a stark contrast to the public spectacle his actions had created weeks earlier. Reporters from across the region gathered outside the precinct that day, their cameras trained on a podium where Chief Hayes stood flanked by 2 members of the city council and a representative from the mayor's office, each of them aware that the entire community was watching for signs of either genuine reckoning or hollow public relations. Hayes spoke without notes, choosing instead to address the matter directly, acknowledging that the department had failed not only Justice Collins, but every resident who had ever felt unsafe in the presence of an officer sworn to protect them. He did not attempt to soften the language of accountability, refusing the kind of vague corporate phrasing that so often accompanies institutional apologies, and instead named the failure plainly as a result of bias left unchecked for far too long. A handful of residents who had gathered along the edges of the press conference applauded quietly when he finished speaking, not out of celebration, but out of a cautious and hard-won relief that perhaps, this time, something might actually change. In the aftermath of his termination, several of the earlier complainants, whose grievances had previously been dismissed, found renewed courage to speak publicly about their own experiences with Mills, encouraged by the undeniable proof captured during Amara's encounter. Their stories, once isolated and easily ignored, now formed a pattern that media outlets and civil rights organizations began examining collectively, painting a fuller picture of harm that had gone unaddressed for far too long. Justice Amara Collins, despite the very public nature of what had happened to her, made a deliberate choice not to use the moment for personal vindication or retaliation against the officer who had wronged her. She declined multiple interview requests in the days immediately following the incident, choosing instead to issue a single, carefully worded statement that focused not on her own anger, but on the broader principle the entire ordeal had exposed. "Justice must never depend on who you are," she said during a brief and dignified address delivered weeks later at a community event unrelated to the incident itself, her tone measured and free of bitterness, despite everything she had endured. The line spread quickly across news coverage and public conversation, repeated in editorials and discussions far beyond the borders of her own state, resonating with people who recognized, in her words, something larger than one woman's personal experience. It became, almost immediately, a touchstone for broader conversations about accountability, about the dangers of unchecked bias within institutions meant to protect, rather than harm, about the courage required to remain composed in the face of injustice, rather than allowing anger to define the response. Her restraint, many observers noted, carried far more power than outrage ever could have, precisely because it refused to mirror the very behavior that had caused the harm in the first place. In the months following the incident, the police department implemented sweeping changes that extended far beyond the termination of a single officer. Reforms that Chief Hayes himself acknowledged were long overdue. Mandatory bias training became a required component of ongoing officer certification, developed in consultation with community leaders and civil rights advocates who had long pushed for exactly this kind of structural change. Body cameras, previously optional or inconsistently enforced, became a strict requirement for every patrol officer, with new policies mandating their continuous use during any interaction with the public, eliminating the gaps that had previously allowed questionable conduct to go undocumented. An independent oversight committee was established to review complaints with a level of scrutiny that had been notably absent in the years leading up to that single Saturday morning, ensuring that future warning signs would not be dismissed or buried the way so many had been before. The committee's first order of business was to revisit every complaint filed against any officer in the department over the previous 5 years, a painstaking process that took the better part of a year to complete, but ultimately restored a measure of credibility to a system that had long felt one-sided to the very communities it was meant to serve. Several other officers, identified through this renewed scrutiny, faced disciplinary action of their own, though none of their cases carried quite the same public weight as the one that had triggered the entire review. Community forums were organized in the months that followed, giving residents a direct line to department leadership for the first time in years, an uncomfortable but necessary process that slowly began rebuilding trust, eroded over a long stretch of unanswered grievances. Hayes attended nearly every one of these sessions personally, choosing to absorb criticism directly rather than delegate the discomfort to subordinates, a decision that earned him a grudging respect, even among residents who remained skeptical that real change was possible. It was slow, imperfect work, the kind that rarely made headlines once the initial outrage faded, but it represented exactly the sort of unglamorous accountability that the moment had demanded. Justice Amara Collins returned to her work on the bench almost immediately after the incident concluded, declining the spotlight that many expected her to embrace given the magnitude of public attention surrounding her case. She granted no extensive interviews, made no rounds on talk shows, and resisted every opportunity to frame herself as a symbol or a victim deserving of sustained public sympathy. She simply returned to the quiet discipline that had defined her entire career, presiding over cases with the same calm authority she had always brought to her work, treating the incident not as a defining moment of victimhood, but as a single difficult chapter within a much longer story of service. Colleagues who worked alongside her in the months that followed remarked on how little the experience seemed to have changed her outward demeanor, though many suspected, quietly, that something within her had shifted in ways too private to share. One afternoon, months after the incident had largely faded from daily headlines, a young law student approached her following a guest lecture she had delivered at a local university, his expression earnest and curious in the way only students grappling with difficult moral questions can be. He asked her directly, without preamble, how she had managed to remain so calm throughout an encounter that would have broken many people, an encounter where anger or fear would have been entirely understandable responses. She paused for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than rehearsed, as though she were considering the question fully rather than reciting a polished line crafted for public consumption. "Because anger wins moments," she finally said, her voice soft but absolutely certain, "but integrity wins history." The student fell silent, absorbing the weight of those words in a way that seemed to settle something within him, a lesson he would likely carry through the rest of his own career. Amara offered no further elaboration, no extended speech about the incident or its aftermath, simply allowing the statement to stand on its own, the way she had always allowed her rulings to speak for themselves rather than relying on grand explanation. She gathered her notes, thanked the student for his question, and walked out of the lecture hall with the same unhurried calm that had carried her through every difficult moment of her career, including the one that had nearly cost her so much on an ordinary Saturday morning that had begun with nothing more than a simple trip for groceries. What remained, long after the headlines faded and the department's reforms took root, was a quiet but undeniable truth that had been proven in front of an entire community and, eventually, an entire nation watching through countless screens. No one stood above the law. Not the officer who had abused his authority through years of unchecked bias, and not the institutions that had allowed his behavior to persist far longer than it ever should have. Even those sworn to enforce the law remained bound by its principles, accountable to the same standards of fairness and dignity that protected every citizen, regardless of status, position, or the color of their skin. It was a lesson learned the hard way, in a public parking lot, in front of strangers with their phones raised, but it was a lesson that ultimately reshaped a department, restored a measure of faith for a community long denied it, and reaffirmed, through one woman's unwavering composure, that true justice could never be allowed to depend on who you happen to be.